Okay. Ok, bonjour tout le monde, merci d'être ici. Je pensais que ça serait une bonne idée de parler un peu en québécois. Now, this was a joke. Please delete this from the YouTube video. This cannot go on the internet. We're here today to talk about what is the best way to learn languages. Now, some of the more kind of quizzical of you may be wondering why there are speech marks around the best way. And the reason why is because this is how British people write sarcasm and irony. Some of you may be wondering, what is a language? What even is that? What does it mean to learn a language? What does it mean to speak a language? How do you even answer that question of how many languages do you speak? I mean, how long is a piece of string? How much oxygen do you consume in a year? You're in the right talk, because that is the vein along which we will continue. Now, the reason why I suppose I should kind of start the story where it begins, and the reason why I'm standing here talking to you guys about what is the best way to learn a language is because a couple of years ago I won an iPad. And I was very bored in my summer holidays at university, cruising the internet, vaguely thinking about my upcoming year abroad and all the challenges that would bring with it. And I saw this great pop-up which said, "Do you know Britain's most multilingual student?" Because if you did, that person would win an iPad. So I entered the competition. I put down 11 languages. I thought that was quite bold. Some of those languages, you know, if it weren't a competition, maybe I wouldn't feel so confident putting down, but I thought, you know, I can battle my way through Italian when I need to. So Italian went on the list. And I heard nothing for a very long time. I thought it must have been some kind of scam. I once got an email actually from the Department of State telling me I'd won a green card to the US. And that was a scam. Now, but eventually I did get an email, and they were like, yeah, cool, so when are you coming down for the interview? And I was like, what, interview? And they're like, yeah, we're going to test you in your 11 languages. And I thought, oh, right, okay. No mention of the iPad. But I went with it anyway. And before I knew it, I was on Skype, and you know, I mean, I wasn't really used to being on Skype back then, so I was just kind of sitting on my bed with Skype. So it was one of those interviews where all they could see was my chin. And but that was good because I was using it to talk. And we got through it, and there was like an hour and a half of all these people asking me really random questions in all these languages, which is quite fun. Like, where do your parents live in 11 languages? Great. The answer was London in all of them. But sometimes that's Londres, sometimes it's Londres, you know, there was a linguistic challenge there. And then at the end they were like, great, you've won. And I was like, great, what about the iPad? And they're like, oh yeah, you can have that too. So I got the iPad, but then one of the things they said to me was, you know, in exchange for this, would you maybe mind doing some media interviews? And I thought, well, you know, they bought me an iPad, so that's the least I can do. Before I knew it, I was in this park, which was freezing at the time, like really, really cold. And with this very, I'm looking for a polite word, but anyway, this reporter who was just telling me all these very, very unclear but very strict instructions, like get behind this tree, come down this slide speaking French, climb up that climbing frame speaking German, do all this stuff now. And we were there for like 3.5 hours, and then we got a 56-second video. So, you know, that was my introduction to YouTube. And before I knew it, I woke up the next morning, and that was kind of at the top of the BBC news feed, which was a very bizarre experience. And I had like 98 missed calls on my phone. How do people get your number? You know, I never gave it out. And I was doing all these media interviews. And one of the questions that I kept getting asked was, you know, so first of all it was like, so tell us a bit about your family, tell us about how great your parents were bringing you up, you must have had great teachers, blah, 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 all very easy stuff. And then they hit you. What is the best way to learn languages? And you go, I don't know. I mean, maybe with an iPad? Like, who knows? But like, what is the best way to learn languages? Tell our listeners, please. You know, what can they do? And then you just kind of go, well, maybe they should do like maybe 10 minutes a day. And they're like, great, Alex Rawlings says do 10 minutes a day. It's like, okay. So this is the problem. I mean, fortunately, in case you don't know the end of this story, a couple of weeks later I turned on the internet, and this kid who was half my age and spoke 20 times as many languages in the US had sprung up, called Tim Donor, and my phone stopped ringing. So I got to enjoy my iPad. But I always found it very hard to kind of answer this question without being extremely cryptic. Because, you know, why did I learn languages? Why was I apparently good at them? And why did people want to know? You know, what could I really tell other people that would really help their lives. Because, the reasons why I learned languages are very personal to me. The languages that I learned were very personal to me. I saw one tweet. There's a lot of internet sludgery whenever anything like this happens. There was one tweet when Alex Rawlings is a white supremacist. Alex Rawlings learns racist languages. And I was like, oh my God, get off Twitter. But the reason why I learned languages is because I wanted to. I really wanted to learn to speak to other people. I wanted to expand my world. I wanted to, it was also a really good game. It was like this escapism for a teenager growing up in the UK, which is a very rainy place. And, you just want to kind of think about what it would be like to live in other countries and adopt other personalities. And I think while you're a teenager and while your mouth is still quite able to get around different accents and things like that, you can do quite a good job of pretending to be from a different country, which is really fun. At various points in my life, I needed to speak other languages. I had friends who didn't speak English and with whom I wanted to start up a friendship and learn about them, and so there was a real need, basically, for me to learn those languages. And then the other thing was that I just liked to. I liked learning foreign languages. It made me happy, and because it made me happy, I felt motivated to keep doing it and to learn more and more and more and to keep discovering the world. So this is really the three reasons why I learned languages. I wanted to, I needed to, and I liked to. But this reason wasn't good enough, and this question of what is the best way to learn a language didn't quite go away. Particularly when I got signed to write a book called How to Speak Any Language Fluently, they were like, this isn't going to cut it. You need to have a little bit more substance to the book than this. So I had to keep thinking about this question, and thinking about this question led to the next question, which is, what is the best way to find out the best way to learn languages? And this led to a kind of spiral. I was thinking, how can I find this out? Maybe I should ask an expert. So I thought, Richard, what's the best way to learn languages?
God knows.
There you go. So Richard's answer disappointed me, as you can imagine. And also, I didn't want Richard to write the book, so I didn't want to get him too involved. But thinking about this actually reminded me of a very famous parable, which I'm sure you all know, which is the parable of the three language learners. Was anyone else brought up on this story? Nice to meet you. I quite like the word parable because it kind of sounds like a Japanese person saying the word palabra in Spanish. But yeah, anyway. So the parable of the three language learners is a very important story, and of course it has a very valuable lesson for us about the different ways in which people learn languages, and of course, what is the best way to learn languages. So there were three language learners, for those of you who don't know the story, which I think was one or two. There were three language learners, and they were all triplets. And they were all very, very difficult, and their mother resented bringing them up very much. There was Jack. Jack was a very kind of hands-on guy. He didn't like sitting in classrooms. He didn't like sitting at the dinner table. He was very fidgety. He was always trying to kind of get one over his siblings. There was John. John was much more of a kind of bookish guy. He liked reading books. He liked learning things, and his mother was sure that he was going to become an academic. And then finally, there was James. James was a runner. James liked to run marathons, and James was constantly trying to improve himself and to find ways to become a better, more rounded, and more complete human being. James was constantly sure that there were shortcuts, just people weren't telling him those shortcuts. And that's what we're going to find out in a minute. Anyway, so they had a fairly difficult childhood, the three language triplets. And, eventually they turned 18 and they were about to leave the house. And because they were quite competitive, they said, you know what? We should set ourselves a challenge. We should all try and learn Spanish. And they said, okay, let's try and learn Spanish. But they all had very different ideas about how they were going to do it. The only thing that they all had in common was that they were all sure that their way was the best. Jack, being a kind of, hands-on sort of guy, the very first thing he did was fly off to Colombia and volunteer on a coffee farm. Now, Jack said, there's only one way to learn language, and that is to go there in immersion, be surrounded by the language, dream the language, live the language, breathe the language, then eventually you just start speaking. However, things didn't quite go how Jack imagined. He didn't understand a lot of what the people were saying. In fact, the only word that he was able to pick out was gringo, which he assumed meant friend. A couple of months later, he realized that's not what it meant. But gradually the months passed and his work continued and his exposure to the language increased and he started to feel more confident. And after about 3 months, his friends would tell him that he spoke Spanish exactly like a Colombian farmer. Absolutely amazing story. But then disaster struck. One day, a letter arrived from the immigration authorities in Bogota summoning him to an interview. He wasn't actually able to read the letter because he'd just learned Spanish kind of working on the farm, so it took quite a long time to understand what the letter was about. And when he got to that interview, he found himself completely unable to express himself because all of his vocabulary was just literally about coffee beans and kind of the things that he had been working on, because that was his immersion experience, which he was 100% fluent in, but those were the limits of his world. So unfortunately, Jack got deported. But all was not lost, because when Jack returned to his home, he decided to set up a blog called SpanishWithJack.com. And in addition to this blog, he set up a $129 a month course, which promised to get people to fluency in Spanish in just 3 months. Now, the reason why Jack's course was so popular is because he was himself a walking success story. He had learned Spanish just by being on a Colombian farm. And so he decided that he was going to recreate that experience of being on a Colombian farm, but on the internet. So he created a virtual farm where you could click on various objects and you would see the translation of those objects in your language, and where occasionally you would get very intense and unexpected instructions in Spanish, like clear out the pigsty, and if you didn't do it, you lost points. Jack did very well. He gained a lot of customers, they recommended it to his friends, and before he knew it, Jack saved up enough money to become a digital nomad. So, as a digital nomad, free, living off other people who was learning Spanish on his website, he moved to Thailand and learnt Thai in 11 days. Jack's next move was to begin venture capital fundraising for his new idea, the Thai farm. John, however, didn't quite fancy the idea of moving to a Colombian farm. That wasn't quite his groove. So John signed up to university and did a BA, an MA, and a PhD in Spanish literature and linguistics. But John found the process very frustrating. He found his progress very slow. He found himself unable to hold normal conversations because he was so paralyzed by all the different options of synonyms and nuances that were available to him through his formal academic education. But the years passed, and soon John's vocabulary grew astonishing. He became an absolutely wonderful Spanish translator, and his translation of Como agua para chocolate became a global bestseller. Anyone read this book? He didn't do Spanish A-level. But then, disaster struck. John had a meeting for his book with a bunch of publicists at a dinner, and unfortunately managed to confuse the word cuchara and cuchillo in front of all of his publicists. There was absolute outrage, and people started to doubt whether John even really could speak any Spanish at all. John tried to insist that there are parts of Patagonia where people do eat gazpacho with a knife, but the public was unconvinced, and John lost his book contract. However, John was inspired by his brother's success, so he decided to set up a blog called SpanishWithJohn.com. He also decided to add a $129 a month Spanish course, which would aim to teach you 10,000 Spanish words in a year. This was a list-based course, and it worked through all the different words alphabetically, basically recreating that experience that he had had at university, but on the internet. At a later date, an investigative journalist who was going through his course noticed that the two words cuchara and cuchillo had been omitted, but the scandal was fairly contained. John enjoyed quite moderate success, and his reputation began to grow. And before he knew it, his old publicist had actually unblocked him on Facebook. He was back. John also then began work on his new book, El Cuchillo, What Really Happened. But there was one triplet left. James, the marathon runner, James, the shortcutter, James, the life hacker. And James decided that he neither wanted to go to university nor Columbia in order to learn Spanish. So instead, he decided he was going to learn Spanish without disrupting his busy life. Having already run 2 marathons and, worked on various series of kind of health food recipes, James decided that the best way for him to learn Spanish was to create memory palaces around which he would place all of the new vocabulary that he was learning. Because he ran 26 miles every time he did a marathon, there were lots of places to put vocabulary on that way. So he found the memory palace technique to be particularly effective. He also came up with an ingenious idea of having mnemonics to remember words that he found particularly difficult to get his tongue around or remember. And in 2 months, James amassed an impressively large and very random vocabulary in Spanish, which made his name. James's ability to recite words like blister, eyelash, and freckle in Spanish with absolutely no second thought quickly made him a household name. It became a party trick amongst all his friends, who became so impressed with his limitless vocabulary that they began to talk about him as some kind of genius. So James decided to set up a course. He called it SpanishWithJames.com, and he taught vocabulary by association for $129 a month. James's fame spread around the world, and he quickly became known as one of the world's greatest memory champions. He was known as having one of the greatest memories on the entire planet. People would say, if you're going to learn Spanish with one of the three, why not learn Spanish with the one who is the memory champion? So he was contacted by a Bolivian TV channel to make a documentary about memory techniques. And James's customers rose to rise, next one. But disaster struck. On his way to Bolivia to film this thing, he realizes he's forgotten his passport at home, which caused absolute consternation. How could the world's greatest memory grandmaster forget his passport? James's inability to remember his passport meant that he missed his flight, but it also meant that his reputation was in ruins. People began to raise questions about whether or not he could really remember anything about anything. James's customer numbers started to drop off, but because all publicity is good publicity at the end of the day, they did eventually stabilize again. So those were the three language learners, the three triplets and their three different courses and the three paths that they took with them. They set up these courses, and at some point the App Store was invented, and they started to get ratings, which were all pretty impressive. You know, more or less 4 stars, which is pretty great if you are a language learning app. But things started to take a little bit of a downturn, which worried the three triplets, sorry. 3 twins is not possible. And, or rather, that means 6 people, which we're not talking about this time. Because around the time when they were more or less at about 3.6, 3.7 stars on the App Store, something horrendous happened. Duolingo was invented. Duolingo quickly wiped out all of their competition with its impressive 4.1 star rating. And before they knew it, the triplets were down to 1.8, 1.6, and 1.9. What had happened? Their lifetime of experience had been wiped out by a Google-funded venture, the story of the 21st century. But Jack, John, and James decided to put aside their differences, and they realized that if they were going to fight the evil owl, they were going to have to work out something between them. So they met up. Jack came back from Thailand, speaking fluent Cambodian this time, and they decided to work out what it was about each of their courses that everybody liked. And they came up with a list of things. They worked out that people liked courses like Jack's because they were practical, they were visual, they were exploratory and fun. They liked James's because they were effective, it had a good reputation, it offered a personalized learning style. And they liked John's because it was thorough, it was academic, and it was reliable, and it was great if you wanted to learn how to read. But they also had problems with the courses. For example, people would complain that Jack's had limited vocabulary. You learned a lot about Colombian farms, but not about the visa system. And they thought that John's was a little bit prescriptive and sometimes a little bit boring. So they decided to work out their differences. And together, they came up with an app that combined the best things of all 3 of their methods. Their technique worked, and before they knew it, they had a 4.2 star rating for their app. So that was the parable of the 3 language learners. That was kind of how those 3 different types of learners go, and how they managed to work out their differences to put something together that was actually far better than any of them could have put up on their own. And the reason why they came to this answer, the way that they came to this solution of creating something that was pretty good and could stand the test of time against the owl of Duolingo, was through collaboration. They decided to put aside their differences. They decided to work out their common ground, and they decided to see what were the commonalities between the 3 of their experiences and the experiences between their users. They also employed a high degree of humility. They, for the first time, stopped saying that, I am the best language learner in the world, but started to see the limits of their own experiences and began to wonder, maybe I'm not entirely right about everything, and maybe I do have stuff to learn from other people. And finally, they managed to be far-sighted. They managed to think about the future. They managed to think about the challenges ahead, and they managed to think about the kinds of questions their users would be asking and the kinds of things their users would want to get out of their course. They collaborated, they showed humility, and they were far-sighted, and they created a great language course. possibly the best way to learn languages in the world. Now, to leave the parable aside for 1 minute, if you were to ask me really what is the best way to learn languages, I'm pretty sure that you would be very disappointed with my response. Because my best way to learn languages is not really anything that you're going to be able to write down, take away, and start applying in the rest of your life. However, through my work, through the work I've done with Richard, running workshops, running conferences, and now, of course, in my full-time job as a language learning resident at Memrise, I come across a lot of different people who have all sorts of different experiences, and from them I can learn and begin to see the commonalities between what works for people and what doesn't, and gradually begin to develop a sense, not necessarily of what's the best way to learn languages for me, but if there is a best method to do it, what it might be. But seeing as you asked, you didn't, but let's imagine you did, my best way to learn languages is very much like eating vegetables. I like vegetables smothered in something else. I don't like learning languages when it's in my face. I like it to be disguised by something. I like it to be in a film. I like it to be in a book. I like it to be on a travel abroad. I like it to be through a friendship I have with someone. It has to be smothered in something else. And if language is a part of it, then I'm on board. I like languages as a side to my main. I don't like just doing languages. It gets a bit repetitive after a bit. I mean, the future tense is fascinating, but there comes a point where you just kind of want to live life. There needs to be a main course. There needs to be a main that goes along with that language. For me, that's culture, that's experiences, and that's the people that I meet along the way. I like languages in small bites, like I like vegetables in small bites. I like to kind of do languages every now and then. I don't like to do it all the time. I get bored of kind of studying for hours and hours and hours and hours, and my experience has shown me that it's not effective learning, and actually the more hours I put in non-stop, the more I go backwards. Actually, one of my Russian teachers in Russia had this wonderful maxim that she passed on to me. She said that learning a language was like rowing against the current, and the moment you stop rowing, you begin to slide backwards, which I thought has been very useful moving forwards. But finally, the way in which I like to learn languages is I like to learn them in lots of variety. I like to do lots of different activities. I like to learn lots of different languages, and I like to keep my brain active in that way, exactly like I see my relationship with vegetables and salad. But, as I've said, I think there is an answer to this question about what is the best way to learn languages, and it is actually my job to find that. I now, as of April, started work as the language learning resident at Memrise, and I'm working very closely with the language learning research team inside the app to create far-sighted learning modes that will help millions of people around the world to learn languages better, to learn them more conveniently, to learn them faster, and to make more progress. And, Memrise are very nice about letting me come here without using any of my holiday allowance, but they were like, could you show these slides that we've prepared? So let's just go through these very quickly. 25 million users, 189 countries, blah, blah, blah. Best app of 2017, 4.7 stars, interesting. 9th best app in the world, blah, blah, blah. I'm very sorry about this, Stephen Krashen, but this is a graph which shows how our users have gone up the more skill modes we added to the app. I'll suggest we add a comprehensible input mode at some point and see how that spikes as well. But so far, this is actually quite an interesting feature. The more skill modes we add, the more users we get. The more grammar we offer, the more people come to the app. Maybe it's just because they don't know any better, but I mean, for our purposes, this seems to work, and this is kind of what we're pursuing. But apart from that, there's stuff that they gave me. There are a couple of principles that kind of underlie the work that we do at Memrise and the way that we're thinking about languages and the way that we want to produce courses for the future that will work for as many people as possible. We think language courses should be convenient. We think you should be able to, pick up languages wherever you are. We think that the language learning material that you're exposed to should be clear. We think there should be clarity of explanation and clarity about what you're doing, what you're learning, and what you should expect the next couple of months of your life to look like. We think that everything that you're learning should be relevant. We think that you should be able to understand why you're being asked to learn a certain word at a certain point. You should be able to see that overview, and you should be able to apply everything you're learning immediately to the world around you. We want there to be a very clear focus of all the topics that we teach, but most importantly, we want learning a language to be fun, which is really the underlying process of the app. Some of you may be looking a little bit confused at me at the moment, because if you've used Memrise and you use those kind of endless, boring flashcards, endless kind of notifications saying you didn't learn any vocabulary today, you are a terrible human being. We're working on it. Okay, and there's something very, very exciting happening because our actual plan in Memrise is to create a course which will allow anyone to learn any language in about 50 hours. The reason why you saw this earlier is because I forgot to hide it with one of the animations when putting this slide together. But pretend you just saw that. So learn any language in 50 hours is the aim of what we're working on. And we're so confident that we're going to be able to do this, and we're currently working basically every day with teams of user testers, with surveys going out to work out what words go in, what words don't, what do people accept, what do people reject. That in November, we're actually doing this absolutely insane thing, where we're taking the Trans-Siberian Express from Moscow to Vladivostok with the research team. And the idea is that the research team gets on the train in Moscow with no Russian and gets off the train in Vladivostok conversationally fluent in Russian. So this is an absolutely insane task. Did you hear about when they took that bus around Europe and filmed people? Yeah, it's a similar kind of thing. The one problem with this is that the only person on the research team who speaks Russian is me. So yeah, a lot of spreadsheets for me for the next few months. But this is what we're going to do. We're planning to teach any language in 50 hours. We're planning to do that in a way that combines all of these key principles. And we're planning to test it on ourselves on a train in Siberia in minus temperatures. Watch this space for more. One of the things that I find most exciting about working for a company like Memrise is that its focus is very much on the future. And I think really passionately that the future for language learning is very bright. We're currently on this kind of cusp of a whole new world which is about to spring up when AI technology kicks in and all sorts of capabilities that were not available in apps before will suddenly be available. It's a little bit like sitting around thinking, I wonder when they'll invent the printing press. You know, when do we have to stop using these slates to like carve everything out? There's going to be a huge change. And I think that that's going to be a very positive change for learning languages. And at Memrise, we're working a lot on virtual reality and on how you'd be able to use things like virtual reality to learn languages, how you'd be able to create your own memory palaces around where you live and the things that you know and the things that you recognize. We're also working on developing extremely personalized experiences, because one of the things that our research has shown is that people like to feel like the course was created for them. Not for the other 25 million users, but specifically for them. And we think that with the advances of AI technology, we're pretty close to being able to do that, to having a couple of introductory chats where you sort of chat with a bot. The bot works out whether you identify as male or female, so gone are the days of having to type ocupado and swearing at the app until it eventually turns into ocupada. It will work out whether you kind of like sport or are even interested in kind of learning all this vocabulary about sport, whether you have a large family and want to learn all these words for like younger brother, older brother's pet dog and all this kind of thing. We reckon that with AI and with extremely personalized experiences, we will be able to work out what it is that you want to learn, and we will be able to provide that experience to you in just a couple of years' time. One thing that I find very exciting is that the app is very soon going to be possible to be invisible. I mean, we are currently working on a number of hands-free features and hands-free modes that mean you won't have to touch it. You can just listen to it and kind of speak to it, and the voice recognition technology will be able to respond to your commands, which means that you'll be able to do it while you're doing the washing up. You'll be able to kind of learn languages in a very sophisticated way, no matter what else you're doing it. We're also integrating at the moment really good voice recognition feedback. We're training the machine to really understand what is acceptable, what is not acceptable, and how to give feedback to the user so that a user may be able to improve their pronunciation. And we've also planned mind-blowing amounts of fun for the future. Absolutely. I mean, if I told you some of the fun features that are in the pipeline, your minds would blow. So I'll save that for now, although I'm happy to take questions on it in a minute. So the moral of the story really is about what is the best way to learn languages is I think we've got to be open-minded. I believe a lot in the polyglot community, and it's been an honor to serve it as one of the co-organizers of the Polyglot Conference along with Richard. Just to be clear, serving you guys is the honor. Working with Richard is okay. But I believe that we have a lot to offer the world. Joking, Richard. I believe we have a lot to offer the world. I believe that, polyglots have amazing experiences that, you can only really gain through learning multiple languages to a very high level. At Memrise, I work with about 3 or 4 pretty impressive polyglots, and we just kind of have this connection. We just understand kind of a lot of the details of the conversations we're having. We understand why you need to teach le pain and not just pain when you teach someone a word. We just kind of get it. And I just think that, all of you guys have those insights, all of you guys have those experiences. They're inherent to learning multiple languages, and I'd like people to be able to listen to them. So be open-minded and be diligent. Be diligent about the things you say, be diligent about the things you write. Many of you run blogs, many of you have YouTube channels, Don't make claims that you may eventually regret. Think about the fact that there are all sorts of people out there who can disprove your experiences and argue that they know better, and ultimately we just enter this kind of cycle of who knows better, and it's a huge yawn fest. And finally, be collaborative. As I said, we've all got experiences here. We've all got strengths, we've all got weaknesses, we've all got things that worked, we've all got things that haven't worked. The one thing that I love about coming to these events, such as the LangFest, the Polyglot Conference, and the Gathering, is that we get a chance to finally share these. And I hope that we kind of take that information, we take that knowledge, we learn from it, and we act on it. Thank you very much. That's the end of the presentation. I'm happy to take any questions.
Thanks a lot for the presentation. I love the parable. When you're creating these apps, how do you deal with the fact of words in actual speech never, ever resembling individual words? So when you combine them, when people speak quickly, when you hear a native speaker talking, it sounds nothing like each individual word that you've learned as a vocabulary word. How are you guys dealing with those?
Cool. So we've got this guy called Mario who sits opposite me, and he's German, but he's very shy about it. And he is a phonetic specialist, and he spends all day with his headphones on, kind of developing these really exciting learn modes, which we call speech-language decoding. And we're developing all sorts of different exercises that currently are not built into the app, but will be built in by the end of this year, where you kind of listen actually to completely incomprehensible input, but are given activities that allow you to kind of interact with it. And gradually what we found is that people build up the skill to be able to segment words, to segment sentences, and begin to pick out from kind of long diatribes that they can't understand, words that they do understand, and gradually build up that skill. So far what we found is that people find that mode extremely exciting. When you listen to a long text, like let's say 25 seconds of someone talking at normal speed, and you're able to kind of answer basic questions about the content of that text, it's really, really empowering and very, very magical. So that is one of our priorities. It's one of our 4 key pillars of the 50-hour project, and we're working on it. There'll be something very soon in the app.
I can raise my voice if everyone's so I was wondering, the project for the Trans-Siberian trip, is it meant to from 0 to a certain degree of fluency, or what are the results that will be measured?
Good question. I guess that depends on my colleagues. That also depends on how good I am at putting the content together. I think our aim basically is to become conversationally fluent. And one of the things that's been very liberating about the way we work is not having to obsess too much about things like A1, A2, B1, B2, C1, C2. These are very important markers. They're very important to be able to measure something. But if we start working towards those things, we suddenly find ourselves very restricted. Why shouldn't we teach phrases at a very early stage that people might think you should only wait until you're kind of at C1 in advance to learn? Why can't you learn a phrase that teaches you the subjunctive in French straight away? We found so far that if we just forget about the Common European Framework of References for our purposes, we feel a lot freer in what we're kind of bold enough to do and what we're bold enough to plan to do in terms of putting together that syllabus. So what I mean by being able to speak Russian is that hopefully they'll be able to have kind of a fairly convincing conversation by the end of that. And hopefully they'll be able to reach a point where they can engage with the language around them and kind of pursue independent study, if that's what they want, to a quite satisfactory intermediate level. Take your pick.
Is that the same level that you aim at when you say learn a language in 50 hours?
Is what the same level, sorry?
The same level of proficiency that
Yes.
you described?
Yeah, we're hoping to get people to a solid conversational level of fluency after which they can interact much more independently with the language around them.
Great talk, Alex. Thank you.
Thanks.
You just wrote a book.
Yes.
Can you tell us a bit about that?
Thanks, Ollie. Your fee is in the post. I wrote a book, this yellow thing. I have a couple of copies of these. I actually declared them when coming into Canada. I ticked that box that was like, do you have any commercial goods? And they were like, what are you bringing into our country? And I was like, there's 9 copies of my book. And they're like, you really don't have to declare that, just go. I wrote a book called How to Speak Any Language Fluently. And writing that book was a very interesting process because my publishers were very strict people. I seem to attract very strict people. And they were very clear that it shouldn't be an ego show. It shouldn't be about me. What they wanted was a guide that could be read by anyone and that basically anyone could get something out of. So the focus of that book is not so much the techniques that I use or me kind of grandstanding and saying this is how you should do it, but here is a kind of a collection of the various techniques of learning a language that I have observed over the last couple of years of being involved in the polyglot community and working with languages both directly as a teacher and also running workshops with you and with Richard. I have copies of the book. If you're interested, come and talk to me. If not, I understand.
I'm just wondering, I'm transitioning from a career in comedy and music to teaching English. It'll be a parallel career. I'm wondering if you have any, if you've seen this working in teaching English where people are using music. I'm imagining that there's some musical areas of the brain that are parallel with language acquisition. And I remember French songs that I learned here in Quebec when I was 10. And so I'm just wondering if you've ever seen ESL teachers using music with any amount of success, or comedy.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I have to preface my answer by saying that I'm not an expert on this field at all. But yes, I like learning languages with music. Does that answer your question? It's definitely a really good thing. I mean, the really good byproduct of that is that you have this cultural access as well, which for me is just so important. It brings the language alive. It makes the students understand why they're there. It teaches them about other people, not just about phrasal verbs. So please use music as much as you want, especially if your students like that.
How do you address,
Where are you, Ray? Hi.
How do you address the issue of accents? And like for some languages there are standard accents, and then there are other languages where there are prestige or preferred accents. Do you look at that at all? Do you consider that at all?
Very good question. I think our aim is to provide people with a variety of accents. I think you'll probably be hard pushed to find a language learning app or course that would say anything different these days. The idea is, we want to expose people to the real language that is out there. My own personal view, though, is that, for listening purposes, yes, you should be kind of listening to as many different accents as possible so you can get that practice. But I think that you should have a kind of a language role model. I think Stephen Krashen yesterday described it as a language parent. Maybe it's a slightly different idea. But for me, when I'm learning a language, I pick somebody and I'm like, I would like to become this person. I would like to speak like them. I would like to assume their kind of identity. And if I mimic them as closely as possible, then I find that I have an accent, even if it's not completely convincing, but at least it's consistent, which I think is the most important thing when it comes to accents.
On the topic of accents, is there going to be an aspect of the app that is sort of a voice input, sort of monitoring how it looks, the kind of way of measuring that, like
Yeah.
phonetics of people?
Yeah, we're working on that at the moment. The problem is that technology is not quite advanced enough to be able to provide feedback that would be useful to a language learner. I mean, the kind of feedback we could give you right now is just not what you want. It's just.
Are you in the ballpark of the right consonant?
Sorry?
Like, are you in the ballpark of the right consonant? Are you even close? It's probably going to be that you get way down.
Yeah, I think basically where we are at the moment is that you get more reliable feedback on your pronunciation from a human being rather than a machine. But the way this stuff works is that we train the machine. We train the machine to understand what a human being would accept or reject as being correct. And kind of over a long period of doing that, eventually the machine becomes as intelligent as the human being. And with the advanced technology, we come closer and closer to that. So the aim is to have something like that eventually in the app, but for the time being, it's just a little bit out of reach.
Hi, Alex.
Hi.
First, congratulations on your new book. I just read it last month.
Thank you.
Amazing content. Thank you. My question for you, you mentioned recently that you're going to stop in your language number 15. So language number 16 is not coming for a while for you. So why you said this, and is it very complicated after a while to keep all language you have right now? Like this, learning is one thing, but keeping all of that is another challenge to, you know? You
Yeah.
agree with this, or how do you see this? Thank you.
Good question. Well, I think it mainly comes down to the fact that I've always been quite adamant about the fact that I'm not a language collector, which is ironic because I went to Wales recently and the one phrase I learned was dwi'n casglu ieithiaeth, which means I collect languages. I'm not interested in collecting languages, and I'm not interested in learning them just for the sake of it. And the reason why there hasn't been a number 16 is because there's not a clear contender. I mean, there are a number of languages that I think I should speak, but I think thinking that you should speak something is not the same as wanting to speak something, and therefore you don't really, I mean, I just can't really force myself to do it. I'm not closing the book, but you know, as I said at the beginning of the presentation, I think everybody has their own language learning path, and everyone has their own languages that they want to learn, their own kind of goals, their own kind of objectives. And for me right now, I think 15 is more than enough, and I probably should actually work on improving some of them, really, and kind of reaching those much more satisfying areas of learning a language of when you're actually very proficient and able to read interesting stuff, say interesting things, and really impress people.
So I have a question about AI. The next, 20 years when we get AI, or near AI, whatever, pre-singularity, what is the marginal utility for using an AI as opposed to a live teacher, like a human being who native speaks the language? Like, what is the marginal utility of that over a human?
Very good question. I think the first thing is that I don't know if you'd necessarily be using an AI rather. I think it's more that AI will enable tech companies like Memrise to produce really cool stuff. And then all of a sudden, there is a game changer, because apps like Memrise are not just trying to compete with existing language learning methodologies, but they're actually creating whole new methodologies which ask you to do things and present you with situations that you just would never have been in as a traditional language learner before. So the way I see it is that kind of very useful, very convenient, and very personalizable language learning materials are very close to coming to us. And because we know that people learn languages better when the material is personalized, when they feel they connect with it, when it's convenient, etc., 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 I think that is going to massively enable people to learn languages better.
Okay, so you're saying it's more like a complement than a substitute for a teacher or somebody in front of you?
Well, I think there's different things. Do we need to substitute teachers? I think teachers have got their own role. You know, teachers are wonderful things, and many of us learn languages with teachers in classrooms, and it's fantastic. But, you know, maybe there are ways to learn languages that are currently not available that will be available in the future. And then, you know, we talk about learning languages through technology as a slightly different thing. It's a slightly different option, and there's no reason why you wouldn't be able to combine that with a teacher, or always use as many different methods as possible. But currently, I feel that a lot of people are trying to ask apps to prove their utility based against what we already have. Whereas in the future, I think that may be the other way around. It'll be more like, you know, why shouldn't I use an app to learn a language?
We'll take two more.
There's one just behind you.
It's not as much a question, although thank you, and I'm very informed, and I'm so glad that I know the right way to learn language. It's more of a response and a comment from the point of view of having taught for many years. I would say that the teacher, as part of this discussion, the teacher in many contexts is going to be quite grateful for having somebody who isn't a complete beginner. You don't always have to take a complete beginner as a teacher, and there are so many things that an AI is not going to give you ever, I think, maybe, in our lifetimes, because the reason you're learning a language is often because you crave interaction, because you want interaction. So if your teacher becomes somebody who is quite happy that you have acquired basics in another language and is quite happy to not take you from 0 to 1 million, but maybe to kind of kick off at the start and incorporate a good app into your language learning. I think the complementation, is that a word? No.
We understood you.
Complementarianism. They complement each other, right? I think they work together. The better apps get, the better AI gets, the better the teachers get.
Definitely, and I think the one thing that we can't forget is that learning languages is about speaking to humans. Therefore, a teacher will always be a human, and there will always be a part of learning a language where you will want to practice speaking with a human. So no matter how good AI gets, it will never be a human. To give you an example of one of the modes that we have right now that we can't release, but we have it, is you can use the camera on your phone to kind of identify any object around you. It will identify it in the language that you're learning, and it will provide you with an alternative 4 words of random things. So let's say we take my phone, I show chair, Stuhl, and I see Käse, Hund, Auto, and I have to pick which one it is. So I go Stuhl. Cool, you got it. And then we point at something else, and it goes Fernseher, TV, and it's like one of the options is Fernseher, Fußballspieler, Wörterbuch, and you basically, this is what we have at the moment, which is hugely exciting, and it means that any environment that you're in can suddenly become a learning environment with the things that are around you, with the language that you're learning. That's what we have right now. In a couple of years' time, the kind of things we're going to have are going to be really, really amazing. I think it's this final question.
Information and what it's attracting. So if the research wisdom says that the skills-based learning doesn't necessarily lead to the most effective language acquisition, but Memrise is getting a lot of users from that, how is this new 50 hours to basic proficiency adapting that and integrating or not skills-based work?
Cool. I think with any language learning company, there's a balance between what we know works didactically and what we know works commercially. And this is kind of the endless tension between the two sides. I work in the didactic side, so for me, my priority is to do things that I know help people to learn. However, because we have this chart and we can see that kind of, even if it's not useful to learn grammar, the fact that we teach grammar means that we get more users, so we kind of, the lifespan of the company gets increased. The company is adding more modes like this. However, what you do within those modes, it can be a completely different thing. It doesn't necessarily have to be about reading endless descriptions of verb tables and conjugations and all that kind of thing. These can be gamified and these can be kind of entertaining. And one of the ideas that we're really focusing on at the moment is using game-style things not just to teach people prescriptive rules, but to teach them kind of subconsciously to spot patterns and to be able to generalize and to be able to identify whether something happened in the past, whether it happened in the future, whether it would happen, and these are the kinds of things that we can do within these skill modes that I guess would correspond a bit better to the research that we have about comprehensive input and that kind of thing, but still kind of satisfy that commercial desire to have grammar in the app. Cool, that's all the time we've got. Thank you very much for your attention.